Ladies and gentlemen, this is version 2 of trying to demystify the concept of debunking royal birth. So the monarchs, as we argued in the first set, we were able to reconcile that there were certain individuals perhaps that gain power through maneuvering or through persuasion or through what? Usurpation of power or even conquest. But you see, the argument here is that the assertion, in my opinion, be that all men are equal and that none is more equal inherently. And in my understanding, this is grounded on the principle of human equality and the fundamental value that all of us are democratically egalitarian society individuals, and therefore what we do or how we do should resonate with the understanding that we're all intertwined in humanity. I'm going to give you reasons why that is my dispensation and why I think that becomes important in terms of equality of inherent worth. The concept of human equality asserts that all individuals have what they call inherent worth and dignity by virtue of being human. And therefore this rejects the idea that some are born with superior qualities or rights, and that's the dispensation we're trying to make. And the aspect of merit and individual potential. Human potential is actually not determined by birth or social status. The argument here is that people from all backgrounds have demonstrated exceptional abilities, achievements, and even contributions to society. And therefore success is often based on merit, effort, and opportunities rather than birthright. I'm trying to debunk the argument of royal birthright as an entity, and that's what we argue in our book. And then this argument of historical inequalities, there's no doubt that the belief in ability, where some individuals were considered inherently superior, has actually been associated with historical systems of privileges or aristocracy and class distinctions. So these systems often led to exploitation and subjugation of those considered as less noble. And that's the argument I'm propounding again. And then in terms of legal and ethical frameworks, we have to understand that modern legal and ethical frameworks emphasize the equal rights and protection of individuals, regardless of their social status, or in terms of and whether or not in terms of discrimination or privileges, they should be based on human innate values rather than noble birth. And so these are aspects that again we're trying to underscore, even as we demystify the concept of royal birth, trying to destigmatize the argument that some people have this privilege status that are imputed upon them over a period of time. I'm going to give you examples of challenges of the concept of nobility and its inherent challenge in terms of superiority. Beginning with the American Declaration of Independence. The United States Declaration of Independence proclaims that all men are created equal and asserts that the fundamental principle of humanity is actually is equal for all intents and purposes. Even when you argue from the French Revolution, the French Revolution of 1789 marked a significant shift away from the notion of inherent nobility and the argument of absolute monarchy, and it promoted the idea of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And that's the argument I'm propounding. And this is something that we have to get our minds out from the things that I see that are happening on the streets of our country. And then the abolition of slavery, movements to abolish slavery and grant equal rights to all individuals, such as the 19th century abolitionist movement, challenged the notion of some people being inherently superior. I mean, for a long time, the Constitution of the US argued that the black man was 3/4 of a human being. Those are arguments that were propounded by false ideologies, propounded by selfish individuals. And then civil rights movements around the world have actually sought to dismantle systems of discrimination and prejudice, advocating for equality and justice for all. So, listen, while the concept of nobility has historical significance, it has actually increasingly challenged in favor of principles of equality, meritocracy, and even individual rights. So modern societies basically emphasize the inherent worth of every human being and work in terms of ensuring that all human individuals have equal opportunities and protection under the law. So, and this is the most important thing that I'm making as an advocacy for debunking this argument of inherent royal birthright. So, listen. it's important, my friends, to understand that challenging the concept of nobility and inherent superiority has actually been a central theme, as I said, in most democratic or what they call egalitarian societies. And I will give some more examples to support the idea that individuals are fundamentally equal. The argument of meritocracy, for example, the principle of meritocracy asserts that individuals should actually be evaluated and rewarded based on their abilities in terms of qualifications, in terms of achievements, rather than their social status or birthright. So in meritocratic systems, opportunities are open to all and people are judged by their actions and contributions. Not this argument, because I am here, I am born by individual X, therefore I have these inalienable rights that have been accorded on me to the dismay of other people. That shouldn't be the case. And then the argument of social mobility. Societies that promote equality often emphasize social mobility, which allows individuals to move up and down the social and economic ladder based on their efforts and achievements. So the ability to improve one's social and economic standing challenges the idea of inherent nobility. And that's the argument again I'm proponing here. Yeah, in my opinion, each one of us are a noble in our own right for all intents and purposes. And then the aspect of educational equality. Equal access to education is a key component in terms of promoting human equality, ensuring that all individuals have access to quality education, levels the playing field and allows people to develop their potential regardless of their background. And that's where some royals, in quotes, took advantage of other people. It's very evident that many of them were taken to be educated because they wanted to have the light of sorts as opposed to other people. Even when you argue in terms of civil rights and anti-discrimination laws, the development of civil rights, for example, and anti-discrimination laws in many countries have actually been aimed at eradicating systematic biases and providing equal protection and opportunities for all individuals. So these legal frameworks again challenge the notion of inherent superiority. And that's the argument we're proponing again continuously. We're trying to debunk this argument of royal birthright. You know, the argument that I'm born royal and therefore everything should follow my needs. The argument of international education agreements. International documents, for example, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, proclaim equal and what they call inalienable rights to all members of the human family. And these declarations reject distinction on birth, race, or even social status. And that is fundamentally true. That's why modern countries have actually transgressed from those, as opposed to some of us countries which still hang on them. If they are ceremonial, yes, but if they become authoritative, then there's a problem. And then the argument of successful individuals from humble backgrounds. Many individuals have actually achieved remarkable success, whether in science or arts or business or in politics, that have come from humble backgrounds, and their achievements underscore the idea of inherent nobility. And in terms of arguing that inherent nobility is actually a fallacy. Yeah. So please understand that the rejection of the concept of nobility and the inherent superiority is actually based on the principles of human equality, meritocracy, and individual potential. So modern societies, in my argument, aims to provide equal opportunities to protect individual rights and challenge systematic discrimination in pursuit of more just and equitable world where all individuals are considered equal and inherent worth and dignity. That, in my opinion, must come very strongly from the argument that I'm trying to promote. So the concept, my friends, of royal birthright, which claims that certain individuals are inherently entitled to rule or to hold positions of power solely by virtue of their birth into a particular family or lineage, has actually been challenged and even criticized in so many ways. So while it has historical roots in many societies, like I argued in our section 1 or volume 1 or perhaps part 1, tracing its origin reveals that it is in its true sense a fallacy for several reasons. As I said, I'll make a point again. Number 1, lack of inherent superiority. Birthright assumes that individuals from royal or noble lineages possesses what they call inherent qualities or superiority that make them more qualified to rule. However, there is no empirical evidence to support the notion that individuals from specific families are inherently superior to others. Zero, my friend. Number 2, historical abuses and injustices. Throughout history, the belief of royal birthright has actually often been associated with oppressive and unjust rule, and the concentration of power within a hereditary elite has actually led to what they call social inequalities, exploitation, and even discrimination. That is something that you need to ponder upon as well. Number three, the aspect of rejection of what they call modern democracies. So in many modern democracies, the hereditary transfer of power is largely symbolic and has actually been abolished altogether. So these countries value principles such as democracy, meritocracy, and equal opportunities over the notion of birthright. Again, food for thought for those of you who believe that food is going to find you on your table, or because subject A is going to bring it for you or is going to sweat for you. That argument, in my opinion, should cease to exist. So we're debunking royal birthright. And then the aspect of equality and meritocracy. The concept of birthright contradicts the principle of equality and meritocracy, which emphasizes that individuals should actually be evaluated based on their abilities in terms of contributions and qualifications rather than their family lineage, as I just made that point. And then the argument of legal and ethical frameworks. We must understand that the legal and ethical frameworks in many countries emphasize that public positions and power should actually be accessed to all based on equal opportunities and under the rule of the law. So discrimination based on birthright is considered contrary to these principles. I think that makes a lot of super sense. So why am I being very passionate about this? Because I see that we have a tendency of coloring certain individual or holding certain individual or exploiting or taking advantage of people who are hardworking to the detriment and the betterment of particular individuals, which in my opinion shouldn't be the case. And then the aspect of changing social values. Social values and attitudes have actually evolved over time, moving away from the idea of inherent nobility or spirit associated with birthright. People increasingly are rejecting this notion that someone is inherently more qualified to lead simply because of their family background. I mean, those arguments should not be seen. In other words, I'm proponing the idea of individual merit, and meaning also that you are created independently, but you also have a gifting that you can actually nurture to make you excel. And then the aspect of success of non-royal leaders. Many leaders have contributed significantly to their societies in the world and have come up with non-royal backgrounds, demonstrating leadership and even achievement that are not limited to individual with royal birthright. I mean, look at Barack Obama, for example, a man with roots from Kenya who went and ruled the world, even including Britain, so-called Great Britain. So while the concept of royal birthright is actually historical, significant, as I said, and it will continue to exist really in some monarchies, its legitimacy and relevancy has been challenged in modern times, and is going to be increasingly seen as a fallacy that perpetuates inequality and privilege based on factors unrelated to individual merit and abilities and qualifications. Instead, societies today, in my opinion, should tend to prioritize principles of democracy, fairness, and equal opportunity. That's the concept, that's the idea, that's the drum major that we're trying to sound. So in essence, the concept, as I said, of royal birthright is a fallacy, and in its true sense, it perpetuates inequality and privilege based on factors unrelated to individual merit or abilities or qualifications. Instead, modern societies should prioritize, as I said, on democracy, fairness, and equal opportunities. We will also argue and understand that historical monarchs often used marriage alliances strategically to strengthen their rule. We argue that in our segment part A, to forge political alliances and expand their influence. I'm going to give you some of those monarchs that try to use marriage to bond these alliances by virtue of marriage alliances. If you remember, there's one that comes to mind, that King Henry VIII of England, the marriage alliance between Henry VIII's marital alliance are among the most famous in history. He actually married 6 times, and 2 of his marriages had actually significant political implications, including the one of Catherine of Aragon. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the King Ferdinand II of Aragon, and Queen Isabella I of Castile, was actually aimed to strengthen England's ties with Spain. So this alliance provided England with support from the powerful Spanish Empire. And then he's also married with Anne Boleyn. The argument here was that Henry's desire for a male heir led him to seek an annulment from Catherine of Aragon, which ultimately led to the English Reformation. So his marriage to Anne Boleyn and the subsequent establishment of the Church of England allowed Henry to assert his authority over English Church and secure his legacy. That tells you an example of how that marriage, a large alliance, consolidated their reign or staying power. There's another one with Isabella the First of Castile. Isabella the First of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, as an alliance. We would argue and understand that Isabel the First of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, often referred to as the Catholic monarchs, married in 1469, and this union united the kingdom of Castile and Aragon, effectively creating Spain as a unified entity. Yeah, and in terms of strengthening its rule, obviously their marriage alliance not only consolidated or solidified their personal union, but also led to the what they call the Reconquista, in terms of the completion of the centuries-long effort to retake Spain from the Moors. So together they oversaw the voyages of Christopher Columbus, which led to the expansion of Spain's overseas empire and even established Spain as the dominant world power in terms of during the age of exploration. Yeah, so we can clearly see that that there's no doubt that we can fundamentally agree that some of these monarchies have a lot to say or to do in terms of what the foundation they laid for us, or for our country, or for the world. But I think it's time to understand that some of these, the tune has changed in a way. There's another one by Maria Theresa of Austria. Yeah, the marriage alliance between Maria Theresa was the Archduchess of Austria and the Queen of Hungary and Bohemia. She married Francis I, the Duke of Lorraine, in 1736, and this marriage was actually instrumental in her efforts to secure her reign and her Habsburg inheritance. Yeah, in terms of strengthening the marriage, obviously the alliance helped Maria Theresa to consolidate support among European powers. However, it also led to conflict, particularly in the War of the so-called Australian Succession, as other European rulers challenged her claim to the Habsburg territories. So despite facing adversity, Maria Theresa's leadership and diplomacy definitely played a crucial role in preserving the so-called Habsburg Empire. Yeah, you could also look at Eleanor of Aquitaine. And now Eleanor of Aquitaine was also another marriage alliance of sorts. Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the most influential women of her time. She married Louis VII of France and later Henry II of England. And her marriages were actually instrumental in expanding the territories of both France and England. So you can clearly see what is happening here. So in terms of strengthening, Eleanor's marriage to Louis VII strengthened the ties between Aquitaine and France and increasing the French monarchy's holdings. Her subsequent marriage, of course, to Henry II of England added Aquitaine to the English crown's possessions, significantly expanding what they call the Angevin Empire. So Eleanor's role as queen consort of both kingdoms gave her a considerable influence over politics and even governance of both France and England. So you can see again the argument that I'm proponing here in terms of in terms of the marriage alliances that created nobility of sorts and expansion of this kingdom. So again, the historical examples here clearly demonstrate how monarchs strategically used marriage alliances to strengthen their rule, to forge political connections, to advance their dynastic interests, and also these unions had often far-reaching consequences, shaping obviously the course of history and the destinies of many nations. I'll argue also in terms of Catherine the Great of Russia. Yeah, in terms of marriage alliance, Catherine the Great was one of Russia's most prominent monarchs, who married Peter III of Russia in 1745, and her marriage to Peter, a German prince, was primarily a political arrangement aimed at securing her position as the future Empress of Russia. In terms of strengthening this particular consortium, if you like, after Peter's accession to the throne, Catherine orchestrated his removal, eventually assuming power as the Empress, and her reign actually marked a period of significant expansion and modernization in Russia. And she's often credited with strengthening and even expanding the Russian Empire during her rule. So again, a clear example of the connection in terms of what marriage alliances could do in terms of strengthening nobility, but also expansion of territories. You could also argue in terms of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. I think I made that disposition in terms of that. But the argument I'm proponing here is that, listen, even though we so much pride and believe in some will argue that the argument of these nobles or cultural leaders, to use that word loosely, is intended to propagate perhaps or make what? A foundational reclaim or what? A sustainability of our culture, of our belongings, of where we come from as what individuals. We're not making any loose what? Any shallow discussion in terms of that. We all believe and we're all proud from where we come from. But the argument, if we're going to propon these ideologies of particular nobility of individuals to the disgrace or to the misfortunes of individual ordinary people, to me that becomes a lost debate, in my opinion. So we have to be very careful even as we argue these. You could give an example of Louis the 16th, for example, and Marie Antoinette. Remember of France, I told you about her. In terms of the marriage arrangement, Marie Antoinette, an Australian archduchess, married Louis the 16th, of France in 1770, and this marriage was intended to strengthen diplomatic ties between Austria and actually France. And in terms of strengthening, while the marriage did reinforce diplomatic relations, it also had significant political implications during the French Revolution, for example. And Marie Antoinette's extravagant lifestyle and her, Austrian heritage made her unpopular with the French people, contributing to the monarchy's downfall, by the way, and the subsequent revolution. And this is where, again, we have to be very careful that sometimes these nobles or so-called royals, again, misuse their power and to the detriment of the common people, and they end up being overthrown. I'll give some examples. We could also argue in terms of Mary I of England and Philip II of Spain. As a marriage alliance, Mary I of England, also known as the Bloody Mary, married Philip II of Spain in 1554. So this union aimed to strengthen Catholic ties in England and also maintain strong Catholic presence in the country. In terms of the strength of the marriage did bring England closer to an alignment with Spain and the Catholic Church. However, it faced significant opposition in England due to fears of Spanish influence, and it did not ultimately secure Mary's rule to the Catholic faith in England, as her reign was actually marked by religious conflict. So again, I'll super emphasize that the historical monarchs and their marriage alliances underscore how strategic unions could have actually both positive and negative consequences for their rule, so for their nations and for their course in terms of history. And the outcome often depends on the political and social dynamics of the time, as well as the personalities and the decisions of these monarchs as they evolve. So even as we make this dispensation, please understand that I am not super against nobility per se, but I'm just saying that it's not right for individuals to exaggerate or perhaps to take advantage of their colleagues under the disguise that they are nobles or they belong to a certain royal family. Because, as I said, we have understood that the creation of this so-called nobility are simply an amalgamation or simply a collection of different circumstances that form to generate into what we see as nobles of today. And some of them by coercion, some of them by bullying, some of them by conquest, some of them by marriage alliances, and some of them by religion or perhaps by parliamentary submissions of sorts. So those are examples I'm trying to argue for you. You may also want to talk about William and Mary of England as a marriage alliance. William III of Orange and Mary II of England, both Protestants, married in 1677, and their marriage was part of the Glorious Revolution, an event that actually aimed to ensure Protestant succession to the English throne. In terms of strengthening, William and Mary's accession to England, to English basically throne, resulted in greater religious tolerance and even the establishment of what they call constitutional monarchy in England, which laid the foundation for modern British governance as we know it today. I could go on, and the reason why I'm laboring to give that is to emphasize where we are coming from, so that if we are to talk about nobility or to debunk this argument of royal birthright, we exactly know where the things are coming from. And I know I'm arguing from a European context, but it sounds a better bell because most of their stuff is documented. Talk about Alexander the Great. He's the marriage alliance between Alexander the Great and the Macedonian king, who strategically married several women from various regions that he conquered, including Persian princesses and even the Bactrian noble women. These marriages, of course, were instrumental in terms of fostering what they call goodwill and even cultural exchanges between Greek and Macedonian conquerors and the conquered peoples. So they also helped to secure loyalty in terms of local elites and also contributing to the stability of Alexander's vast empire. And so again, you also may want to talk about Elizabeth I of England as a marriage alliance. Queen Elizabeth I of England famously never married, a decision often referred to as the Virgin Queen. She used the prospect of marriage as a diplomatic tool. Okay, and think about that. She used the prospect of marriage as a diplomatic tool. Yeah, and in terms of strengthening, by not marrying, Elizabeth I maintained her independence and prevented foreign powers from actually gaining influence over England. Her reign is actually often seen as a time of relative stability and flourishing cultural achievements. So that is something you may want to also argue. I know I talked about Louis the XIV. No, I talked about Louis XVI, but there's also one of Louis XIV of France. In terms of marriage alliance, Louis XIV, known as Sun King, married Marie Teresa of Spain as part of a strategic alliance with Spain. He also arranged marriages for his numerous children to strengthen political ties with other European nations. In terms of strengthening, these marriages basically aim to bolster France's position in Europe in terms of securing alliances and also promoting French interests. So Louis XIV's long and influential reign actually helped solidify France's status as a major European power. The reason why I'm giving a lot of European examples is because it would help us paint a picture so that we know where the things come from. And as examples, I know Africa has also existed quite long, probably as long as the world was created, but fundamentally, when we argue in terms of an African perspective, whether you want to argue in terms of what, the king of Uganda, or perhaps in terms of historical perspective, you will understand that many of these kings or nobles, or even the Zulu king perhaps, have their bearing in terms of subjugation or conquest, even the one of Bunyoro, in terms of those concepts. So you would understand that where they're coming from, it's a question of how they were made and how these alliances and how the nobility and how these the kingdoms were propounded, short of theirs that are not as old as the ones of like the one of Uganda for that purpose. You could argue Helena of Aquitaine and Henry II of England. Their alliance, Helena Aquitaine married Louis VII, the seventh of France, and later Henry II of England. And as it had significant political implications, as they actually, both added possession of both France and England. And Helena's marriage basically expanded, as I said, territories for both France and England. And her role as a queen consort in both kingdoms basically allowed her to wield considerable influence over politics and even governance in these realms, further consolidating her family's power. Incredible to note that many of these nobles, to use that word again, had to do with many, without being unfair, women as well. And these women wielded a lot of strength and power, as we have just seen. And it's very important for you to understand that the argument of, I just told about Queen Nzinga, in the argument of the African context, of how much power she wielded in terms of her conquest, in terms of her power, in terms of her dominance, for those of you who would like to look at it in the African context as well. So, as I said, when you are trying to argue the debunking unbanking or debunking the royal or the kingship or the royal myth, or this argument of royal birthright, you must comprehend and understand how these entities were formed and what relevance do they have today, and whether or not we can still use them as an argument to propound ideologies that used to be the same. Like I said, many of them were lucky because of fate, perhaps, some deliberate, others undeliberate, chance perhaps, but more so, the point I'm trying to make is how relevant are they today, and what part are they playing for us? Are they more like ceremonial figures for us to look back and what? And hullabalize and get excited about, or are they dominant in our lives that we should, lay our lives for, to the detriment of individual survivals, as used to be the case? No wonder there are substantive, quite a number of monarchies that really did not do very well in terms of the things that they were doing, in terms of the abuses, excessive abuses, in terms of how extravagant they were, in terms of how cruel they were to the people they were leading, in terms of how despotic they were. So these things must also come into play, and that's the argument we're proponing, that this idea of the fact that you've been lucky enough to be given some power, and then you use it to the detriment of your people because you think they're a lesser version of you, then to me that becomes a problem. And that's why we're trying to so much debunk the idea of this so-called royal myth, if you like, or in terms of debunking the so-called royal myth, in terms of understanding the do's and the don'ts and the hows, in terms of how it came. So as we continue to make this argument, I will argue and I'll give examples of certain individuals in the Ugandan context, for example, whose rule, in spite of the fact that they were kings, have actually been challenged in terms of the dispensation of liability visited upon them. I'll give an example of Sir William Wilberforce Kadombola Nabyope, who was actually jailed for fraud in 1968 because he had disillusion with a guy called Patrick, and he was jailed for actually 18 months. And it tells you that in spite of the fact that he held this office as a Chabazinga or Busoga, he still had he could easily be visited with criminal liability. We could also argue in terms of Kabaka Mutesa, for example, who was actually sued by a gentleman called Mulira because he had actually taken his wife. So this argument of sweeping statements that all women belong to the Kabaka and he could do anything at his whim, or at a mere clip of a finger, was no more. And it is a clear demonstration of an indication that, listen, I think we are living in times that are changing, but even though you have these so-called powers on you because of history, we should not use them to the abuse of the rights and the interests of other people. I mean, those are all documented. If you go to our book called Demystifying the Fountain of Honor, the Executive Constitutional Mandate, we have made a lot of reference to some of those issues in terms of trying to comprehend whether or not these so-called untouchables can actually be touched or can actually be visited with the liability. We have seen quite a number of cases here in Uganda, for example, where people like Mabirizi have actually sued the Kabaka, people like Kalemera have also sued the Kabaka, and then we could also argue in terms of the despotic acts that were done or carried on by certain individuals under the emblem of being kings, beginning with with the likes of the killing of the martyrs, for example. And with two different kings, by the way, in Buganda for that purpose. Sekabaka Mutesa in terms of the martyrdom of the Muslim martyrs who were actually still murdered in Namugongo, and then the other gentleman also who killed the so-called martyrs in Namugongo. We could argue that that it was perhaps a victimization by the Muzungu because they wanted to make their case because he was very strong in terms of fighting colonialism together with the Bunyoro king. You could argue there's that school of thought, but the proposition we're trying to propound here is that there's truth to the fact that some of these people were quite vicious in terms of their actions and in terms of the way they governed their society. Perhaps that was a way, a mandate, or perhaps a way of trying to corner or put people within their instill fear into them and subjugate them so that they can be able to do things as required by them. And we're not saying that rulers, whether democratic or not, didn't have or don't do these things, but we're trying to say that whether or not it's a question of birthright, whether or not it's a question of political alliances, whether or not it's an election, regardless of whatever power or someone may yield, I think it's important that we understand that we all come from the same, in my opinion, we're grafted from the same root, and that none of us is actually more equal than the other, and that we should be, the best we could celebrate and jubilate is that we're all different, yes, in nature, in the context of our giftings, but we're all intertwined. To use Dr. King's words, that we are inextricably bound. For whatever reason, you cannot be what you're meant to be until I am what I am meant to be. So my friends, once again, I thank you. Consider this volume or section 2 of trying to debunk a royal birthright. God bless you, and thank you for your attention.